All right, let's continue this S6 History 4 period class on the Armenian genocide. So this is part 2. Now, something momentous happens in 1908. It's the emergence of the Young Turks. The Young Turks, these were they they were they formed this group of reformers. So this group of people who overthrew the Sultan. Um, so you can see that they wanted a more modern and a constitutional kind of government. And in the beginning, the Armenians were quite excited about this because they thought, okay, if these reformers wanted something more modern, and at the same time, the Armenians were fighting for civil rights. They thought, maybe this is the time when, they were going to get a place in that society, in Turkish society. However, unfortunately for the Armenians, the Young Turks, they were nationalistic and they wanted to make the empire more Turkish. So imagine that the empire was also a multi-ethnic empire. But the Young Turks, from the point of view even of these reformers, groups within the empire who were not Turkish. Um, and if you imagine that you see religion as being part of the Turkish identity, so if you were non-Christian and at the same time you were non-Turk, a non-Turk, then you would be perceived as a grave threat. And so this was how the Armenians were perceived even by these reformers. You already know this. 1914, World War I begins, and the Turks they side with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So religious authorities declared a holy war against all Christians, of course, except for their allies. Okay, so imagine, for instance, it's easy to see Russia as an enemy, from the point of view of the Turks. And some people, especially those with the, you know, I suppose more prominent voices, they started to argue that the Armenians were traitors. They weren't only a threat; they were obviously traitors. Um, some people suppose that the Armenians would be hoping for the victory of the Allies over Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Turks, and that the Armenians would be quite eager to fight for the enemy. To some extent, these suppositions would be true in the sense that imagine being Armenian and then you've only experienced suffering, pain, humiliation, inequality within the Ottoman Empire. And then war breaks out. So some of the Armenians, they, organized volunteer battalions and they helped the Russians fight the Turks in this particular region in the Caucasus. So imagine you're the Turkish government. So what do you do? So from their point of view, okay, there are enemies within our midst. There are enemies within our nation itself, this nation state that we've just established. So what do we do? So their thinking was we have to remove this internal threat. That's precisely what they tried to do. So it begins. On the 24th of April 1915, this is the beginning of the Armenian genocide. This called by Armenians as Red Sunday. You know, they they remember this as, an important an important date because this is when these horrific acts that they suffered begin. So the Turks, they would begin with the intellectuals and the community leaders, so they would arrest them, and then they would move on to harass ordinary Armenians. They would expel them out of their homes. They would be sent on death marches. They would go to, for instance, Syria, so through the Mesopotamian desert. These are basically death marches because the Armenians were forced to do this without ample rest, without food, without water. The Armenians who marched, they were humiliated. They were, you know, their clothes were taken off, and they were just forced to walk until they died of exhaustion, until they were too tired to do anything. And if you stop, for instance, if you stopped to rest for a while, you were shot on the spot. So, and the Turks even created, a special organization like the Nazi death squads. So these were killing squads, or you can call them butcher battalions. So they did all these horrible things. They raped girls and women. They drowned people in rivers. They hanged them. They threw them off cliffs, crucified them. So just nasty stuff. Also, the government kidnapped children, so they were given to they wanted to convert them to Islam. They were given Turkish families. Like I said, women were forced to they were raped and they were enslaved. They were forced to join harems, for instance. And then some of the locals, some of the Turkish people, they just occupied the homes of the Armenians, took over their possessions. Okay, so the Armenians were dispossessed. They were forced out of their homes, out of their towns and villages, uh, killed in various horrific ways. So imagine that in the beginning there were, before all of this, there were about 2 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. In the early 20s, only about, 388 thousand Armenians were left. Like I said, some people deny that this ever happened, or some people, do not even refuse. Do not even use the word genocide. They refuse to acknowledge that this event qualifies as genocide. Okay, so like I said, Turkey doesn't recognize this as a genocide. It's just Erdogan has described this as mass killings. The United States, the United Kingdom, even the European Commission, until a certain point, some people they might recognize the fact that the events happened, this particular event happened, but they wouldn't. They stop short of calling it genocide. Okay, so that's why it's important to keep this in mind. That's why it's important to know about this so that we don't forget, and maybe that would help towards preventing something like this from happening again in the future. Okay, I stop here, and I'll see you in the next class.